If you want to call yourselves a science, you can't keep doing the same thing you've done for 30 years and call that science. That's not science. So you have to keep advancing.
Hey there, my name's Ashley Church.
And I'm Erin West.
We were once newly promoted crime scene and latent print supervisors on mutual struggle buses as we both simultaneously tried to navigate through the challenges within our forensic units.
Now we run a business where we create tools and resources that we wish we had had to make these transitions easier. We like to talk about the experiences we've had in the forensic field, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the hopes to create awareness around these issues and move the needle forward to create positive change in the forensic community.
So if you're a forensic professional, regardless of your years of experience, who's not afraid to dive into real, raw, and sometimes uncomfortable topics, you're in the right place.
This is the Forensics Unfiltered podcast.
By popular demand, we are going to be discussing whether or not the forensic community is behind the times. So tonight, Erin cannot make it out, so it's just going to be me. And before we get into the points that I want to make, I do want to just recognize like how far we've come just in the past couple of decades. Just think about where we were with DNA in the 90s and where we are now. Like, it's incredible. The minute trace evidence that we can get is just amazing, right? And we continue to break through those boundaries of how small of a sample can we get and still get DNA. And we've made a lot of breakthroughs in other areas as well. If you think about it, I know I've worked with people in the crime scene world that are like, man, I remember a time not too long ago, like at the beginning of my career, where, you know, it wasn't a common practice to wear gloves. And now, like, we wouldn't dare touch anything without gloves. I even worked with someone, like, it was kind of a spicy lady in the morgue. And in the morgue, they didn't wear gloves either. And it was just like a normal thing for her just to, you know, touch dead bodies and gurneys and all sorts of things in the morgue without gloves on. So we have made a lot of advances. I don't want to discredit our community in that way, but I do think there's a lot that's holding us back from advancing even further, faster. So this is just going to be my opinions. Like I mentioned before, if you guys want to add to anything, I would love that, especially from the laboratory perspective. So I just have the fieldwork perspective, and I think, I've never worked in a lab, but I think the forensic laboratories are more standardized. There's more strict protocols on what they can and cannot do. And, you know, if there's new advances in technology, like, they're supposed to embrace it. And I think sometimes in the field work, we don't have that governing body. We aren't standardized. And so there's a lot of variability in the way we do things. So I think that's also kind of what's holding us back in some ways, I think. So first and foremost, I do think, again, this is field work, there's not a really solid relationship between academia and the field. So I know I've heard like a lot of CSIs, they're like, we basically have to retrain what they've learned in college when we get them in the field, because I don't know if what they're learning is outdated or it's not typically how we do things in the field. Like, that right there is kind of showing like there's some break in communication. I remember whenever I was in grad school, I went to grad school for entomology. And something that my advisor made me do was go to like several entomology conferences throughout the year. And they were huge, guys. The entomology conferences were huge. And the grad students, or students in general, had a very big involvement in them. So I volunteered 16 hours of my time at the conferences, and I was able to get free registration. She also made me do poster presentations and give the 15-minute talks. So there's like a competition for that too. And there are some forensic organizations that do that well. They have a lot of big student involvement, and then there's some really big forensic organizations that have very little forensic student involvement. And I think we're missing out on that, because in the entomology conferences, there's a lot of people like, you know, that were older showing up to the 15-minute student talks. And it was great because the students can learn from the people that have been there, done that, and the people that maybe, you know, haven't been in touch with the latest and greatest things that are going on in academia. They get a little sneak peek of the advances that we're making in the research. And I think we're missing out on that in the forensic community, at least in the field work. Again, my perspective is not with the laboratory stuff, but in the field, I was really close to a really big college that has a forensic population, student population, and I don't know what the research was going on over there. So I do think that we're not able to advance as far as we could because we haven't like made those connections. We haven't made those relationships. So in my opinion, I feel like we're a little bit behind the times because there's not communication between academia and people in the field. That's just from my experience and my perspective. You may have a really good relationship with your colleges that are around you. And if you do, I think that's great. Continue doing that. But the most we talked to the colleges near us was when we just needed an intern. I also think it's very easy for us to fall behind very quickly because, at least at the agencies I worked at, I mean, we were burning out really quickly with the amount of work that we already had. And there was no like quality assurance manager that was scouring through all of quarterly or annual journal articles that are released every single year. And there was no one in our agency that had the time to really read up on, you know, all of the research pertaining to your particular area. So if you don't have anyone in your agency that's doing that, you're just going to keep, you know, spinning the wheels, right? And doing the things the way you've always done it because you have no idea that there's new technology. There's been some research that says, you know, this powder is better than this powder, or this dye stain is superior to this one. So you're just going to unknowingly fall behind the times because there's no one in your agency that is appointed to keep up with the research. So that's kind of sad because all of these people are spending a lot of time doing very quality research, and you probably just don't have any idea that there's these new studies coming out. And it's not a fault to anyone at the agency. They have enough work on their plate, but that's why like having a quality assurance manager would be a really great idea. But if you work at a law enforcement agency, they don't really understand that. And they're like, well, that's a lot of money for a position that we don't see the value in. However, if you explain it to them in a way that they would understand, I think they would be more willing to maybe at least consider hiring someone to be that person in your lab. So for instance, in law enforcement, I am sure there is someone at the agency that is appointed to make sure that the protocols and the procedures that the officers are doing on a daily basis or the detectives are like current. Especially like if you think about use of force right now, huge, right? So I'm sure there's more recommendations on situations where they should use certain uses of force, or situations where they shouldn't use certain levels of force. So it would make sense to appoint someone in the agency to keep up with that research, keep up with those studies. So same thing with the forensics world. But that's, again, like you can quickly fall behind if no one in your agency has the time to read through all of the new studies that are published every single year, right? All they're going to keep doing is what they know, and they're going to pass that knowledge on for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and you're just going to keep doing the same things you've always been doing, not even realizing there's a better way to do it. Sometimes I think it's because of money. This is another like taboo topic. Should forensic units stay attached to law enforcement units, right? Well, the thing with law enforcement units is they're a government agency, and the government agencies only have so much money. And so you're going to get what you pay for, right? Same thing with the state labs. They're run by state government, so they only have so much money. And the stuff in forensics is expensive. So for instance, if you have like a DNA lab at a state lab and their equipment, oh, I mean, I'm sure it's like six figures, like at least a few $100,000 for those instruments, right? And then they have to keep up with those instruments and yada, yada, yada. So they're gonna hold on to that instrument as long as it keeps chugging along, right? And, you know, 10, 20 years down the road, there's newer and better and greater instruments out there, but they're hella expensive. So the state agencies are gonna be like, yeah, no. So I think that's why like we're seeing more and more private forensic labs popping up, and our state labs are using it a lot. So I know our state lab, would outsource whenever they have a really large backlog, they would outsource a lot of cases to the private labs because they have the money to be able to do it. They have the bigger, better equipment. And sometimes we would send our cases directly to the private labs because they have better capabilities because their instruments are newer and greater and do all the fancier things. I think that in and of itself, we can fall behind the times just because forensics is expensive and the government bodies can't keep up with or don't see the reason to keep up with updating their technology and their equipment, because the old equipment still works fine. So why do we need to replace it, right? And that's where we can become outdated pretty quickly. Like I mentioned before, I know for a fact some of the DNA labs, the private DNA labs, have even more capabilities than our state DNA labs because they have the more updated equipment. So some of the other reasons why I do think we could be more behind the times is, and I don't mean this to be mean or call anyone out, but I think sometimes we are knowingly resistant to the technology because it's complicated and it took you so long to learn how to do things at the beginning of your career. Like, okay, if I'm going to have to retrain and learn how to use this new instrument, like that's a lot of time and investment, and I don't have that time and investment right now. So I'm just going to ignore it and just keep doing the things the way I've always been doing them. And I've seen this in several entities within the field work at least. For example, I had to do a lot of reading. I never finished it, but I did finish the bulk of it to do the pre-screening DNA lab stuff. So I had to read 9 different articles from the 90s and early 2000s about blue star versus luminol, and how basically at the conclusion of all of those articles, and there was a lot, the conclusion of most of those articles was blue star was superior to luminol. And there's a few different reasons why, but I won't even get into that. So anyway, all you have to know is the conclusion was blue star is superior to luminol. But we are still very widely using luminol, and it's even being taught in a lot of our trainings and workshops within the forensic community. And I'm not trying to bash anyone if you use luminol. I'm not trying to bash you for using it, but I'm saying since the 90s, we've had this other tool that has proven time and time again to be more superior, and yet we choose to keep using what we're comfortable with. Another thing that Erin has noticed too is Photoshop in the latent print world. It's a great tool. You can magnify a print up to 300 times, which is a lot greater than any other manual magnifier that you can get out there. But many people don't want to learn how to use it, so they just choose to keep doing the things they've always been doing, even though there is technology out there that can improve their work. Latent prints is not my thing, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. And if you want to fight with Erin on using Photoshop versus the glass, you can fight with her on that, but I know her opinions, and that right there, it just goes to show you the vast difference in our field. There's people all over the country and all over the world that are doing things so differently in the same field. I have also heard some people, so the 3D laser scanners, they're just now gaining a lot of traction, but that technology has been around for a decade or more. But I know agencies were so resistant to using it. They're like, well, it has a plus or minus error of 0.25 inches. Y'all, that is a hell of a lot less than any human error in measurements. So I know people have like straight up sabotage, like they intentionally don't charge the batteries so that they don't have to take the Pharaoh out to their scenes because they don't want to learn how to use it. Or it is a lot of time investment, and you go through all of this work to create these 3D scans, and your state attorneys don't want to use it in court. We had that resistance too, and it took probably 3 or 4 meetings with our state attorney to say, this is what it's capable of. This is the difference for your jury, like a 3D interactive scan versus a 2D drawing. What would you rather have? And once I like taught them, like, this is how you would introduce it in court, this is what it's capable of, they were all about it. They're like, oh my gosh, why haven't we been doing this for like years? So just keep fighting the fight. Like, don't just try it once and be like, well, they're not going to use it in court, and so we're just not going to do 3D laser scanners ever. Like, that's not the mentality that you should have. If you want to keep progressing in the field, yes, you're going to have some resistance. I'm sure it was scary for the first person ever to introduce DNA into the court system, just like it might be scary for you to introduce 3D laser scans in your local court system. But you can't be afraid of it. Just embrace it, and if it doesn't work the first time, keep trying. Same thing with just like general technology. We know there are some agencies out there still using film. You can capture so much with a DSLR camera, and you can take so many more photos. Like, if you're still using film, again, like, are you behind the times? Are you keeping up with technology? And I know there are still agencies that are handwriting reports. They're handwriting their forms. They have the carbon copies of the forms, and it's like, if you just learn or create a digital form or something like that, it's actually going to, number one, be way easier and better for court because people, you know, their handwriting just is terrible sometimes. But also, like, you can become more efficient too and reduce the errors, but it takes some growing pains and you have to embrace it. And that's the thing too, is like, if you want to truly call this a science, we're going to continue to advance in science. We're going to debunk stuff that we thought was good to use, you know, back in the day. And we learned that, oh, that was actually really bad for our evidence. And, you know, we change things. That's, if you want to call yourselves a science, you can't keep doing the same thing you've done for 30 years and call that science. That's not science. So you have to keep advancing. And yes, you're going to have to retrain and re-educate yourself and learn how to do new things. And it's going to be hard. And when you felt like you finally got a grasp on things and, you know, this new thing gets introduced and you're going to feel inferior all over again, like, that's what science is. Just go to grad school and you'll become very humble and be more willing to learn new things. I do think also, again, like, this may not be as prevalent in the labs, but I do know in the field work, we can become behind in the times just because we don't have like a governing body to enforce standardization. There's not really anyone that's like enforcing this is the way you should do things and this is how you should do them. So it's kind of a free-for-all in the at least the field work. So even within the same county, like, we had several police departments in the same county and they were all doing things so differently than us. We were doing things differently from the county next to us, from state to state. So I know that a lot of people really hate accreditation and it gets a really bad name and it's a pain in the ass. But there are some things that I think are good to keep us moving forward and advancing as a science and making sure that we're not behind the times. And if we have a certain procedure or protocol that is outdated, it forces us to use something that's more scientifically sound. So again, I don't want this to be like me bashing the forensic community. That's not the case at all. But I do think there's some room for improvement for us to be able to continue advancing in the career in the field. I think part of that comes to like us coming together as a community and agreeing on how to do things a certain way, and not just be like, well, just do it however you feel like you want to do it. That's not going to ensure that we're all consistent in how we conduct our work. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a great night. We will see you next week on Taboo Topics.
Thank you so much for being here and listening to Forensics Unfiltered. If you liked this episode, would you do us a favor and leave a review letting us know specifically what you liked about this topic? It will only take a minute, but it will really help us plan future episodes so we can bring you more topics that you want to listen to. We'll be sure to provide any links from today's episode in our show notes on our website. Head to www.gapscience.com. Until next time, stay safe out there.